the silence in a crowded room is often louder than a scream. I learned that on a rainy Tuesday night in November, the kind of night where the wind howls against the window panes, as if trying to warn you of what is coming. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 65 years old. And for a long time, I believed that love was synonymous with endurance. I believed that a mother's heart was designed to absorb impact, to buffer the sharp edges of the world for her children, even when those sharp edges came from within her own home. But there comes a moment in every life when the soul simply refuses to be compressed any further. This is the story of how I lost my family home, but found the woman who had been hiding in its shadows for decades. Perhaps you are listening to this because you feel small in a place that should make you feel safe. If so, listen closely, because dignity is not something you are given. It is something you must retrieve from the cold floor where you dropped it. It all culminated on the evening of Isabella's dinner party. My son, Daniel, had married Isabella 3 years prior. They lived with me in the Victorian estate my late husband, Arthur, had bought 40 years ago. It was a house that breathed history, with creaking oak floorboards and the scent of lemon polish and old paper. I had tried to be the invisible matriarch. I had tried to be the ghost in my own life, fading into the wallpaper so as not to disturb the modern, sharp-angled life Isabella was trying to construct within my walls. That afternoon, Isabella swept into the kitchen like a storm front. She was wearing a dress the color of spilled wine, her makeup flawless, her eyes scanning the countertops with a critical precision that always made my stomach tighten. I was peeling potatoes, wearing the blue linen apron Arthur had given me for our 25th anniversary. It was faded now, soft as flannel, smelling of rosemary and memory. "Mrs. Vance," Isabella said, her voice tight and clipped. Her smile was a razor blade wrapped in silk. "Tonight is crucial for Daniel's promotion. The CEO is coming. My parents are coming. I need everything to be absolutely perfect. So, please, do not hover. I have hired caterers. I do not need your rustic cooking cluttering the aesthetic." I nodded. I always nodded. It was the currency I paid to keep the peace. I retreated to my bedroom. The room I had shared with Arthur. The room where I had nursed Daniel through fevers and heartbreaks. I spent the afternoon listening to the sounds of the house being taken over. The caterers arrived with their metallic clatter. The music started. A smooth jazz playlist that felt too impersonal for these old walls. At 8 o'clock, the aroma of truffle oil and roasted lamb drifted under my door. I had not been called for dinner. But I assumed it was an oversight. Surely, in the chaos of hosting, they had simply forgotten to knock. I adjusted my cardigan, smoothed my gray hair, and walked down the hallway. The staircase creaked under my feet, a familiar sound that usually comforted me, but tonight it sounded like a warning. I reached the dining room archway. The scene before me was like a painting from a magazine. The crystal chandelier, which I had hand-cleaned just yesterday, sparkled above the table. My grandmother's silver candlesticks were arranged amidst elaborate floral centerpieces I had not chosen. 10 people were seated. Laughter tinkled like glass. Isabella sat at the foot of the table, radiating triumph. Daniel was at the head, pouring wine, his back to me. Then, Isabella saw me. The conversation at the table did not stop immediately, but her eyes narrowed, and that was enough to freeze the air in my lungs. She stood up and walked over to me, blocking the entrance, blocking the view of the guests. Her perfume was overpowering, a heavy floral scent that masked the smell of the food. "Mrs. Vance," she whispered, but the hiss of it carried. "What are you doing down here?" I blinked, confused. "I came for dinner, Isabella," I thought. She let out a short, sharp breath of exasperation. "Oh, Eleanor, look at the table. It is full. There is no room. This is a business dinner. It is for important people. It is better if you eat in the kitchen." I stood frozen. The words hit me like physical blows. Eat in the kitchen. like a servant, like a naughty child, like a dog. I looked past her shoulder. I saw the empty space where my chair usually sat. It had been removed. She had physically removed my place from the table of the house I owned. Then, perhaps sensing my hesitation, or perhaps just wanting to twist the knife, she raised her voice. The chatter at the table died down. Everyone turned to look. "Go eat in the kitchen, Eleanor. You are making the guests uncomfortable standing there in that old rag. I only want people who matter at this table." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a burning shame that pricked at my eyes. I looked at the blue linen apron I was still clutching, the old rag. I looked at Daniel. He had turned around. He was holding a wine bottle, frozen mid-pour. Then at the floor. He said nothing. My son, the boy I had raised to be a man of honor, said nothing. That silence hurt more than Isabella's words. It was the sound of my heart breaking. I turned around. I did not run. I did not cry out. I walked back toward the kitchen. My head held high. Though my knees were trembling so violently, I thought I might collapse, but just as I pushed the swinging door to the kitchen, the front door opened. The wind gusted in, carrying the scent of rain and wet leaves. It wasn't a guest. It was Daniel's mentor, Mr. Sterling, the man whose opinion mattered most tonight. But the draft made the candles flicker, and in that moment, the spell of the room broke, and Daniel, my son. Before I tell you what happened next, you must understand the architecture of my life before Isabella arrived. You cannot appreciate the sound of a crumbling foundation until you understand how painstakingly it was built. Arthur and I bought this house when we were in our 20s. We were young, foolishly in love, and poor in everything but ambition. The house was a wreck. We spent our weekends sanding floors, painting walls, planting the garden that now bloomed with hydrangeas and roses. Every nail in these walls held a memory. Arthur was a man of quiet strength. He was a carpenter, and his hands were always rough, calloused, and warm. He died 10 years ago, on a Sunday morning, reading the paper in the sunroom, just like that. One moment he was commenting on the weather, and the next, he was gone. The silence he left behind was deafening, but Daniel stepped in. He was 25 then. An architect, just starting his career. He moved back home for a while to help me manage the estate. We grieved together. We healed together. We had a rhythm. Sundays were for pancakes and classical music. Tuesdays were for gardening. He would tell me about his designs, his dreams of building skyscrapers that touched the clouds. "Mom," he would say, "you are the foundation. Nothing stands without a good foundation." Then he met Isabella. She was an interior designer, sharp, modern, ambitious. She dazzled him. I understood why. She was everything we were not: fast, shiny, new. When he introduced us, she looked at the house, not as a home, but as a project. She had said, "If you just clear out the clutter." I didn't realize then that I was the clutter she intended to clear. They married quickly. Isabella moved in. "Just until we find our own place," Daniel said. But months turned into years. Slowly, my home began to disappear. My velvet armchairs were replaced by sleek, uncomfortable white sofas. My landscape paintings were taken down for abstract art that looked like angry slashes of paint. My kitchen, once smelling of yeast and vanilla, became a place of kale, smoothies, and silence. I made myself smaller. I stopped playing my records because Isabella said the noise gave her a headache. I stopped cooking with garlic because she said the smell lingered in the curtains. I retreated. I thought I was being a good mother-in-law. I thought I was making space for their happiness. I didn't realize I was digging my own grave. Back to that night. I was standing in the kitchen, the swinging door settling behind me. I was alone. On the counter sat a tray of cold hors d'oeuvres that the caterers had rejected. I stared at the stainless steel refrigerator, seeing my reflection. A gray-haired woman in a blue apron, eyes wide with shock. I was shaking. Suddenly, the kitchen door burst open. It wasn't Isabella coming to scold me. It was Daniel. He looked frantic. He had abandoned the guests. He had abandoned the CEO. He stood there, panting slightly, his tie askew. He looked at me. Really looked at me. For the first time in 3 years, he saw the tears I was refusing to shed. He saw the trembling of my hands. He saw the woman who had taught him how to walk, how to read, how to be a man, standing in the corner of her own home like a discarded appliance. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. I turned away, busying myself with a dish rag. "Go back to your guests, Daniel. It's a big night." "No," he said. He walked over and took the rag from my hands. He threw it on the counter. "No." Isabella burst in behind him. "Daniel, what are you doing? Mr. Sterling is waiting. You are embarrassing me." Daniel turned to her. His face was pale, but his eyes were blazing with a fire I recognized. It was Arthur's fire. "You sent my mother to eat in the kitchen?" Isabella rolled her eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake. Stop being dramatic. She doesn't fit at the table. We need the seats. It's just one dinner. She understands. Don't you, Eleanor?" She looked at me, expecting me to nod, expecting me to smooth it over, expecting me to lay myself down so she could walk over me again. I looked at my son. I saw the conflict in his face, the fear of his wife, the love for his mother, the pressure of his career, and I realized that if I stayed silent now, I would not just be betraying myself, I would be betraying him. I would be teaching him that this was acceptable behavior. I did not nod. "Isabella," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "This table is mahogany. Arthur and I bought it at an auction in 1985. We refinished it by hand. I have hosted Christmas dinners, Thanksgiving feasts, and funeral wakes at that table. There has always been room." "Always," Isabella scoffed. "Well, times change." Daniel looked between us. He looked at Isabella's sneering face, and then at me, and something snapped. The cable that had been holding him to her demands finally frayed and broke. "Where is her chair?" Daniel asked. His voice was dangerously low. "I put it in the garage," Isabella said, crossing her arms. It didn't match the rental chairs. Daniel didn't say another word to her. He walked out of the kitchen. We heard his heavy footsteps going down the hall, out the side door. The wind howled as the door opened and closed. Isabella looked at me with pure hatred. "Look what you've done. You've ruined everything." Minutes later, Daniel returned. He was wet from the rain. He was carrying my heavy oak chair, the one with the velvet cushion. He marched past the kitchen, into the dining room. I heard the gasps of the guests. I heard the scrape of wood against the floor as he shoved the rental chairs aside to make space. He came back to the kitchen. He took my hand. His grip was firm. "Come, Mom." "Daniel, you don't have to," I started. "I have to," he said. "If you don't eat at the table, nobody eats." He led me into the dining room. The guests were silent. Mr. Sterling was watching with intense interest. Isabella's parents looked horrified. Daniel placed me at the head of the table. He took the crystal wine glass from Isabella's place setting and put it in front of me. He took the plate from her setting and put it in front of me. "Sit, Mom." Isabella stood there, her face a mask of red fury. "Daniel, what are you doing? That is my seat." "Not anymore," Daniel said. He stood behind me, his hands on my shoulders. "This is Eleanor Vance. This is her house. She is not staff. She is not a nuisance. She is the reason we are all standing here under a roof. And if anyone has a problem dining with her, the door is unlocked." Isabella looked around the room, desperate for an ally. But the room had shifted. Mr. Sterling, the CEO, cleared his throat. He picked up his glass. "To Eleanor, he said. A house is nothing without its heart. One by one, the guests raised their glasses. Isabella stood alone. She let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, turned on her heel, and ran upstairs. The slamming of the bedroom door echoed through the house. We ate dinner. Daniel served me personally. He put the choicest cut of lamb on my plate. He poured my wine. He ignored the empty chair at the foot of the table. We talked. For the first time in years, I spoke about Arthur. I spoke about the garden. I spoke about the history of the house. Mr. Sterling listened intently. It was a triumph. But triumphs in battle do not always win the war. That night, after the guests had left, the real storm began. I was in the kitchen washing the crystal old habits die hard when I heard the screaming from upstairs. It wasn't just an argument. It was an evisceration. Isabella's voice was shrill, hysterical. Daniel's voice was deep, exhausted. I'm sick of her. I heard Isabella scream through the vents. She's like a ghost haunting us. I want her out, Daniel. I want her out in a nursing home where she belongs. She's 65. Not 90, Daniel yelled back. And this is her house. I don't care. It's her or me, Daniel. You choose. Right now. You choose. I stopped scrubbing. I dried my hands on my apron. I walked to the living room and sat in Arthur's old armchair. I looked at the fireplace. Cold and dark. I thought about the victory at dinner. It felt hollow now. Yes, I had eaten at the table. But at what cost? My son was upstairs, being torn apart. His marriage was disintegrating. The house was filled with poison. I realized then that I had been fighting the wrong battle. I had been fighting for a place at a table where I was resented. I had been fighting to hold onto walls and floors, thinking they were my identity. But I was not the house. I was Eleanor, and Eleanor deserved peace. Eleanor deserved to be somewhere she was celebrated. Not just tolerated. I realized that by staying, I was allowing Daniel to remain stuck in this toxic tug of war. I was the excuse Isabella used for her unhappiness. I was the crutch Daniel used to avoid facing the reality of his marriage. The screaming stopped. A door slammed. Silence returned. But it was heavy, loaded silence. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The house was gray and still. I didn't go to the kitchen to make coffee for everyone. Instead, I went to the attic. I brought down 3 suitcases. I packed my clothes. I packed the photo albums. I packed Arthur's letters. I packed my favorite books. I did not pack the silver. I did not pack the china. I left the things that belonged to the house. I only took what belonged to me. At 7 a.m., I called a taxi. At 7:30, I was standing in the foyer, my bags beside me. Daniel came down the stairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He saw the bags and froze. Mom? What are you doing? I'm leaving, Daniel. What? No. No, Mom. You don't have to go. I fixed it. I told her. You didn't fix it, son. He ran down the stairs, grabbing my hands. Mom, please. This is your house. I won't let her kick you out. She isn't kicking me out, I said, looking him in the eye. I am choosing to leave. There is a difference. But where will you go? Martha Higgins has a spare room. I spoke to her this morning. She's happy to have the company. Martha lived across town. She was a widow, a retired school teacher, and my oldest friend. Mom, don't do this. I can't handle her alone. That, I said softly, cupping his face, is exactly why I have to go. You need to see your marriage clearly, Daniel. Without me as the scapegoat, you need to see Isabella for who she is when there is no one else to blame. The taxi honked outside. Daniel started to cry. He was 35 years old, a successful architect, crying like a lost boy in the hallway of his childhood home. I kissed his forehead. I love you, Daniel. I walked out the door. I didn't look back at the garden I had planted. I didn't look back at the porch where Arthur and I used to drink iced tea. I got into the taxi and told the driver to drive. The first month at Martha's was a blur of grief. I felt like a limb had been amputated. I woke up reaching for a bedside table that wasn't there. I walked into rooms expecting to see my furniture. I missed the smell of my house. I missed the ghost of Arthur. But Martha was wise. She didn't coddle me. She gave me space. Sarah, she said one day. She always called me by my middle name. You have been a wife, a mother, and a widow. Maybe it's time to find out who you are when you aren't being any of those things. I needed money. I had a small pension, but I wanted independence. I didn't want to take a dime from Daniel. I saw an ad in the local paper. A young family, the Harrisons, needed a housekeeper and cook. I applied. Mrs. Harrison was a busy lawyer with 3 children and a chaotic house. When she interviewed me, she looked at my hands. You've worked hard, she said. All my life. I answered. She hired me on the spot. It was strange. Going from being the mistress of an estate to a housekeeper. But in a way, it was liberating. I cooked because it was my job, not because I was begging for affection. I cleaned because I was paid to, not because I was trying to prove my worth. The Harrison children, Leo, Mia, and Sam, adored me. They devoured my stew. They fought over my cookies. They asked me to tell them stories. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not as a nuisance, but as a necessity. Meanwhile, Daniel's life was unraveling. He came to visit me on Sundays. We sat on Martha's porch. He looked thinner every week. The dark circles under his eyes grew deeper. She changed the locks, he told me one week. She painted the dining room black. Can you believe it? Black. It's her house now. Daniel, I said, sipping my tea. It feels cold, he said. It feels empty. Even with all her new furniture. She fired the cleaning lady. She says nobody cleans it right. She orders takeout every night. I didn't say, I told you so. I just listened. A few months later, he came to me looking shattered. She wants to sell the garden, he said. She wants to pave it over and put in a swimming pool. She says the roses are too much work. My heart gave a painful lurch. Those were Arthur's roses. We had planted them the summer before he died. But I breathed in, and I breathed out. It's just dirt and roots, Daniel. Memories are not in the ground. They are in you. He looked at me with wonder. How can you be so calm? She took everything from you. No. I smiled. She took the objects. She took the walls. She didn't take me. In fact, she gave me back to myself. And it was true. I had started a small side business. The Harrisons' friends had tasted my baking and started ordering cakes for birthdays, pies for Thanksgiving. I called it Eleanor's Kitchen. I was making my own money. I was saving for a small apartment. I bought a new coat, a bright red one, something the old Eleanor never would have worn. I joined a book club. I took a pottery class. I was blooming late, like a winter jasmine. But I was blooming. Then came the crash. It was a Tuesday. Almost exactly a year after the dinner party. My phone rang at night. It was Daniel. Mom, can I come over? He arrived with a suitcase. The same look I had on my face when I left. He collapsed onto Martha's sofa. He talks Martha's. Oh, Trays. It's over, he said. What happened? She threw out Dad's chair. The old leather one in the study. She said it smelled like old man. She put it on the curb for the garbage truck. He put his head in his hands. I saw the truck take it away, Mom. And I couldn't breathe. I realized she wasn't just erasing the house. She was erasing us. She was erasing me. He looked up, tears streaming down his face. I left her. I filed for divorce this afternoon. I sat next to him and held him. I didn't feel triumph. Divorce is a tragedy, no matter how necessary. It is the death of a dream. But I also felt relief. My son was back. The divorce was ugly. Isabella fought for everything. She wanted spousal support. She wanted the cars. She wanted the house. But the house had a surprise for her. Without me there to manage the maintenance, without Daniel there to fund the repairs, the old estate had started to rebel. The roof leaked. The boiler broke. The expensive modern renovations Isabella had done were shoddy and started to crack. The house was hemorrhaging money. Isabella couldn't afford it on her own. Her parents couldn't bail her out. She had to sell. But the market had turned, and because she had stripped the house of its historic charm, painted over the woodwork, and paved the garden, the value had plummeted. She sold it at a loss. She moved into a condo in the city. Daniel moved into a small apartment near Martha's. He started therapy. He started to rebuild. One afternoon, I was at the grocery store, buying flour for a wedding cake order. I turned into the aisle and collided with a woman. "Oh, excuse me," I said. "Eleanor?" I looked up. It was Veronica, Isabella's mother, the woman who had sat at my table and watched her daughter humiliate me without saying a word. She looked tired. Her hair was messy. She wasn't wearing her usual pearls. "Veronica," I said, nodding politely. She hesitated, then grabbed my arm. "Eleanor, I need to say something." I waited. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for that night. For everything." I looked at her. I saw a mother who was burdened by the sins of her child. "Isabella is miserable," Veronica said. "She calls me every day screaming. She blames everyone. She blames Daniel. She blames the house. She blames me. She says we all failed her. She's alone, Eleanor. She has no friends left. Even I. Sometimes I can't bear to pick up the phone." I felt a pang of pity. Not satisfaction. Pity. "Veronica," I said gently, "you cannot build a home on a foundation of contempt." Isabella thought she could demand respect without giving it. She thought she could shine by blowing out everyone else's candle. But darkness is just darkness. Veronica nodded, wiping her eyes. "I am," I said, and I meant it. I walked out of that store into the sunshine. I thought about the blue linen apron. I still had it. It was folded in my drawer in the small apartment I had finally rented just last week. It was a cozy place, full of light, filled with plants I had bought with my own money. I don't use that apron anymore. I bought a new one, a white one, crisp and clean. I realized then that the dinner party hadn't destroyed my family. It had saved us. It had forced the poison to the surface. It had forced Daniel to find his spine. It had forced me to find my wings. If I had stayed, if I had eaten in the kitchen, if I had swallowed my dignity one more time, we would still be there. I would be a shadow. Daniel would be a shell. Isabella would be a tyrant. Leaving was the act of love. 3 years have passed since that night. I am 68 now. My baking business is thriving. I have a boyfriend, a charming retired professor named Harold, who loves my red coat. Daniel has remarried. A wonderful woman named Claire, who loves gardening. They bought a fixer-upper, and we spend weekends sanding floors together. Sometimes we drive past the old estate. New owners bought it. They are restoring the garden. I see the roses coming back. People often ask me if I hate Isabella. I tell them no. Hate is too heavy a burden to carry when you are busy building a new life. I feel for her. She taught me the most important lesson of my life. She taught me that my place at the table is not determined by a chair. It is determined by me. So, if you are listening to this, and you feel like you are disappearing in your own life, if you are making yourself small so someone else can feel big, if you are eating in the kitchen of your soul while others feast on your kindness, stand up, pick up your chair, and if they won't make room for you, build your own table. The food tastes much better when it is seasoned with dignity, because silence has its time. But so does roaring. And believe me, nothing scares the wolves more than a sheep. that finally realizes it is a lioness. My name is Eleanor Vance, and this is my story. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to leave a place you loved to find the person you were meant to be? I read every single one.